Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. We're taking a look on the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy administration, a different perspective here from a professor at UCF named Jim Clark.
Dr. Jim Clark, one of my colleagues in the history department thereof, and we do invite you to put an ear on the radio. Some interesting commentary and a couple of things that I'm almost certain that you never knew about November 22nd, 1963. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. It's so great to be here with you on our 80-plus stations across Florida and on Tough TV 38. And we are very pleased to be on Tough TV 38. If you don't get Tough TV 38 in Orlando and the surrounding areas, please call your cable or satellite operator and ask for it. Tough TV, of course, is a great new Tough TV is a great new network similar to Spike. So if you enjoy programming on Spike, you'll enjoy Tough TV as well.
Especially at 9 a.m. on Thursdays and Saturdays.
That's because when we are on.
That's when we're on.
And we like that time best.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you again, Al. Lots to talk about today. I had been speculating for some months now about Charlie Crist and the Democratic nomination for governor, and you have gotten some word through our newsroom that this deal of him announcing and having going for the nomination may not be set in stone just yet.
No, not set in stone. A couple of years ago, there was some buzz at a Clinton Global Initiative fundraiser. This was actually 2 weeks ago. Neil Roth, who's a big-time Democratic donor, couldn't believe he was hearing it. Yet again, it looks like Bill Nelson's looking hard at running, a booster of the senator said. Roth's first reaction was, why do we keep shooting ourselves in the foot? Charlie Crist can't beat Bill in a primary. The insider whose name Roth won't give up replied. Roth said, you're missing the point. We can't afford a Democratic primary where we come out broken. If Bill wanted to run for governor, he should have done it before Charlie filed. There's a reason for the shock. After months of ebbing and flowing, the story of Bill Nelson running next year seems settled in October. Nelson had all but said he wouldn't do it and potentially endanger the very Senate seat he won last year. Now the story of his candidacy is again resurfaced amid new undertones of intrigue, envy, ambition. It sounds like politics to me. But
back up just a few words, and I think you put your voice right on the key there. He all but said he wouldn't. He never said he wouldn't. He all but said it, but he never said it. And we talked about that here. And when the Democrats had their convention in Orlando, there was a great deal of coolness and uncertainty and unfriendliness towards Charlie Crist, with a number of key fundraisers in the Democrat Party saying they don't trust him.
Well, and here's the thing. We have a Nelson who is still thinking of possibly running. We have right before and after Charlie Crist filed, a Nelson advisor quietly started calling donors so that if something happens when Charlie's candidacy falters, who's waiting in the wings?
Well, and let's turn the clock back a couple of decades. A run for governor would not be a new idea to Bill Nelson. When he was in the state cabinet, he very much made plans to be the governor of this state. And so this is not unexplored territory for Bill Nelson.
So this is nothing new. Although a seat in the Senate is something that governors usually aspire to, not the other way around, right?
I know, but there is precedent for that in this state. Lawton Chiles was persuaded to give up the Senate seat to come back and run for governor so that the Democrats could hold on to the office, and he won. And he won 2 terms, and he even beat Jeb Bush by a little bit. The next time around. I
think the bottom line is this: there are certain people in the Democratic hierarchy in this state who still see Crist as a liability and see him as weak because he's a unknown entity. He's been a Republican for many years. All of a sudden, he's a Democrat. How are other Democrats going to take him? The voters. And this is a backup plan. I guess they say it's good to have a backup plan. Although the problem is if you get into an inter-party war, it makes everybody look bad on that side of the ticket.
I have 2 words for you for the most recent attempt at doing that happened in Pennsylvania, and that is Arlen Specter.
That's right. Mr. Magic Bullet himself, who we'll be talking about.
Yeah, all right. Well, tell you what, let's take a pause along our network line here. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we will be joined by Dr. Jim Clark from the University of Central Florida History Department as our conversation continues. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we are delighted to welcome back to the Florida Roundtable Castle here my colleague from the University of Central Florida History Department, Dr. Jim Clark. Jim, nice to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back.
Welcome back again, Jim. It's always good to have you.
Thanks, Al.
Well, we have just passed the anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. And what kind of got me motivated on this a little bit was a couple of weeks back, I happened to be in Jim's office up in Colburn Hall, and we were having a little conversation about such things. And Jim said to me, something happened on that day that affected our lives. Aside from the assassination, he said, and I'll bet you don't know what it was. And you know what? I had not the foggiest notion. You want to take a stab at it, Al? Or did I don't remember whether I told you what it was. I did.
No, you didn't. But now I'm very curious. So of course, let's let Jim let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah,
it is a significant day for Orlando. In fact, you have to wonder if we would be here today.
I was going to say maybe the opening of UCF or something, because UCF is celebrating its 50th year, right?
Well, UCF had seemingly been the huge event of that year. We got a university. And that was going to be a major leg in our economy. But the biggest event in the history of Orlando occurred on November 22nd, 1963. The story begins years earlier when Disneyland first opened in California. Walt Disney immediately began thinking of an Eastern theme park. He found that only 2% of the people coming to Disneyland came from east of the Mississippi, so it created a huge potential there, and he kept denying it. He kept saying, no, I've got to do work on this park, there's so much to do, but almost from the beginning, he was thinking an East Coast park and looked at a number of sites, beginning with Niagara Falls, which, as you remember, back then was one of the top 5 or 6 tourist destinations in the country.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah. I was a little kid. My family took me there.
Yeah. The only problem with that is it gets so cold and stuff.
That's what Walt found out. You could have made a lot of money being a consultant to Walt Disney, Al.
Born too late, darn it.
That it could only be open a few months a year. They looked outside New York City, and there again the weather was an impediment, but also Walt was worried about the competition from everything you can do in New York. They looked at St. Louis. In fact, came very close to signing a deal in St. Louis. In fact, the New York Times reported they were going to sign a deal in St. Louis, and that kind of died out. They looked outside Washington, D.C., and that died out. And finally, they turned to Florida. They almost did a deal at West Palm Beach with the MacArthur Dairy family down there. And they looked at about 3,500 acres that the MacArthur family owned, and they were going to do a joint deal with MacArthur, who was one of the richest men in the state, certainly. And that fell through. The concept had some issues. And then finally, they narrowed it down to Central Florida. Mm-hmm. And on Wednesday, November the 20th, Walt flew in his private Gulfstream into Tampa. Secrecy already a vital part of the Disney operation.
Yeah.
And on Thursday, he drove up to Ocala. One of the things people don't know is that Walt's parents and grandparents lived in Lake County in a tiny little town called Paisley.
Yes.
They lived in Paisley. You've been there?
I've been there.
Well, you can't get there from anywhere.
I spent a week there one night.
It's just south of the Ocala National Forest, and the road structure is such that if you go to the big city, you would go to either Daytona or Ocala.
Yeah.
So Walt had been to Ocala a number of times when he would come down to visit family members in Lake County. So he knew the area. And Ocala had some advantages. Ocala was higher in elevation than Orlando by about 20 feet. But as you know, once they got into the land out there, it was far swampier in Orlando than they ever imagined. I'm not sure if they had known what they were getting into, they would have done it. But the land in Ocala was high and dry. Yeah. Secondly, Ocala had one of the best road systems in the country in the days before the interstate system.
Yeah.
Route 27 went all the way up from Miami to Canada.
Yeah.
301 was the old East Coast route. You may have traveled that as a youngster. And 441 went up to Tennessee. So it had fantastic highways. So it had a lot going for it, and Walt knew the city. Then on Friday, he drove back to Tampa, spent the night there. On Friday, the 22nd, he got in his plane, and they flew to Orlando. Mm-hmm. And where I-4 and the Turnpike intersect, they flew over that. Walt looked out the window of the plane and pointed and said, "That's it."
Wow.
And he was pointing at the Dimitri property, 12,400 acres of land owned by Bill Dimitri and his cousin. And, of course, in Central Florida, we know Bill Dimitri is one of the great philanthropists, creating the Boys and Girls Town here. Yeah. And they then, again, secrecy vital, so he didn't land here. And he instead decided to return to California. They had to stop in New Orleans for fuel. And when they landed in New Orleans, someone came out to the plane and told them President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas.
Wow. That is a great tie-in with Orlando history because, well, Walt was a visionary and saw that those two major arteries were going to be where he was going to put it because he knew that would be able to handle the traffic. And I'm assuming that, right?
Yeah, I think the traffic was the key. The other thing Orlando had going for it was its airport. Mm-hmm. City leaders had enough foresight, and you got to give these guys credit. This is in the 1940s when Orlando was kind of a sleepy little town, and our airport was what's now Executive Airport, the old Herndon Airport, where you simply could not have ever landed big planes there.
Right.
They reached out to the Department of Defense and, in an unprecedented deal, got them to share the air base.
Yeah.
And so it became a combination airport and Air Force base. Which has never happened before.
Which used to be known as McCoy.
Right.
And now is known as OIA, which is why whenever you book a flight to Orlando, it says MCO.
Right.
It doesn't say OIA because it's the old McCoy. They kept the old McCoy name.
Right. And, of course, on the tags on your suitcase, it says MCO. And people look at that and say, what the heck is MCO? So Orlando had this great airport, and because it had been an Air Force base, you could land any plane you wanted to. One of the runways was, I think, 14,000 feet. So it was just an optimal location, as it turned out, for Disney.
Yeah, we could, and we could speculate, too, since he was flying over the area on November the 22nd. Had he known, or had the president been assassinated a day or two earlier, the trip might never have occurred. They would have felt it was inappropriate to be doing this secretive corporate business when the president had been assassinated.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And this is one of the great imponderables of history. They had gone up to Ocala, and what would have happened if Kennedy had been shot the day before? Certainly Walt Disney, who was known to everyone, would not have been wanting to hang around a Tampa hotel. Reporters would have asked him for his reaction.
Yeah.
So he probably would have gone back to California.
Mm-hmm. And he probably would have said, okay, we're going to build it in Ocala, because he wouldn't have seen that intersection, the crossroads of I-4 and
I think that's correct. Would we be cheering for the Ocala Magic? Would we be going to the Ocala Philharmonic?
I don't know too many people cheering for the Orlando Magic right now, to tell you the truth. But
so a huge day, and of course Kennedy had been kind of a temporary resident of Florida, so he had spent huge amounts of time here. So it really kind of is a day that all ties in is significant for Florida history.
Well, I wanted to focus now on that 50th anniversary. This will really be the last time we celebrate the anniversary. That's the wrong word.
Major observance.
Observe the anniversary. Because after this, it'll be 60th and 70th, and everyone will be either dead or very old. And of course, so this will be probably the last time that we memorialize this anniversary. And so I wanted to get your take on what you think, because, we've had Jesse Ventura on, and, of course, he explored some possible alternative explanations to the Warren Report, which, from various polls that have been done, between 61 and 85% of the American people no longer believe the conclusion that it was just Lee Harvey Oswald acting as a lone assassin. So I wanted to get your thoughts and what you think is the right answer.
As a historian, I see this all the time. It is hard to believe that a nutcase like Lee Harvey Oswald, a nothing really, who had led a very troubled life, could kill a great man. This is true of any assassination. You look at these people, John Hinckley shooting Ronald Reagan, and of course he survived, but James A. Garfield being shot by a crazy man, President Garfield. And the fact of the matter is that the MO of assassins is usually loners who have troubles.
Yeah.
And in the 50 years since the assassination, we have had hundreds and hundreds of books written, often now contradicting each other. There's a new one out. One of them had said that he was shot, of course, from the grassy knoll. Now there's one out saying, no, he was shot from the other side. So the conspiracy theories are contradicting one another. And somebody said that there was a conspiracy theory about the conspiracy theories. Why are they being put forward? But, the fact of the matter is that had governments been involved, had other nations been involved, somebody would have sold their story by now. And it just hasn't happened. And, one of the strange things to me about government is that people who, you look at Obamacare right now, they can't even get the computers to work. And yet we think these same governments are capable of launching these grand conspiracies of black helicopters and assassinations. And clearly, this is not the case.
All right. Well, we'll talk more about that. We seem to have a disagreement, and I love the disagreements on radio shows. They're always fun. So we'll talk more and hit some main points and see if we can convince you otherwise.
Let us take a pause along the network line here. We'll remind you that you are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Dr. Jim Clark from the UCF History Department. We're going to talk about what Jim has been up to, too, here in a little bit. He's got a brand new book out that we want to talk about for a couple of minutes. But if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is my colleague from the University of Central Florida History Department, Dr. Jim Clark. And Jim, it is always a pleasure to have you with us here. And I do want to mention that you have a brand new book out we're going to talk about for a few minutes here a little bit later, A Brief History of Orlando, Florida. And wow, visit Orlando. Good roads, pure water, no insects. That's from a black and white picture with a horse-drawn thing on. No insects.
It is, and they took that billboard to Tampa.
Well, but you have to understand they had really strict immigration laws back then, they stopped them at the border, Reagan.
They took that billboard to Tampa. You'd think people in Tampa would know Orlando had insects.
Right. Yes. All right. Well, we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But we were talking about the November 22nd and the fact that Walt Disney had been flying over Central Florida that day and picked the land for Disney World on that very day.
It's amazing. I had no idea about that.
There's a story you can amaze your friends with when you're by the water cooler. Say, did you know? You know, that's one of those things that we love to pull on the students. You know, it's one of those amazing facts that kind of slipped through the cracks. But the Kennedy family in Florida, very strong ties and lots of relationship here.
They did. Joe Kennedy, the father, bought a home in Palm Beach in the 1930s, a mansion that had been built by the Wanamaker family, the big department store people from Pennsylvania. And John Kennedy was a little bit old. He wasn't one of the younger kids who came and played on the beach and went swimming and things like that. He was kind of off. He was in high school. He was doing things, getting ready for college. But as he grew older, the Palm Beach house became a refuge for him. As you know, he suffered horrendous health problems, primarily related to his back, and underwent a number of surgeries. And he would go down to the home in Palm Beach to recuperate. And so this became a place where he recharged his batteries. In the 1950s, he underwent his most serious operation. We forget that John Kennedy was given the last rites 3 different times during his life. And they thought he was going to die after this surgery. He survived. He spent several months in Palm Beach recuperating, and it's there he wrote Profiles in Courage, which won the Pulitzer Prize and really kind of made him a national figure, propelled him onto the national scene. The weekend before he died, he came down for a weekend in Palm Beach. He went out and did some things. There's a great picture of him with former Senator George Smathers in a convertible riding through Miami. But he also transacted some business. He went to Tampa to speak at a union meeting, and he went to Cape Canaveral.
Yeah, right.
To see how the space program was going. The year before, of course, he had made the pledge that the United States would land a man on the moon in the 1960s, and we did it by 5 months. But there was concern, how's it going? Is this going to work? And there was, even while he was at the Cape, some discussion this is 1963, remember, of partnering with Russia on space exploration. He had, as you know, we had gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Our relations with Russia were about as low as they could get. And the thinking was that this would speed up any space effort, but also that it might bring the two countries closer together to have some sort of a joint project like this. And of course, that did happen a number of years later. But at the time, when he met with some of the astronauts and the NASA officials over there, they proved to Kennedy that they were on track, that they could get this done in the 1960s decade, and he dropped his plan then for joint space exploration with Russia. But who knows, had he survived, that might have come back as a diplomatic tool.
Yeah, the whole thing might have been very, very much different.
And of course, for the Cape, this is very confusing. but the bases over there had various names. You remember Patrick?
Sure.
And some numbers. The space centers kind of things. And after the assassination, a week after the assassination, President Johnson ordered that the complex be changed to Cape Kennedy, the Kennedy Space Center, as we still know it today.
Right.
But he also ordered that the geographic area be called Cape Kennedy.
Right.
There's a board in Washington, as you know, Reagan and Al, that names these things. And he ordered the board to change Cape Canaveral to Cape Kennedy. The town of Cape Canaveral had just incorporated, and it did not change its name.
Yeah.
Although everyone was so confused by this that that they kept calling it Cape Kennedy. And Cape Canaveral had huge historic significance. People don't realize that it was the first place in North America given a name. When Ponce de Leon sailed up 500 years ago, he named Cape Canaveral. That was the very first thing he named, and then he named Florida, La Florida. And so the citizens over there did not like this, and they fought it, and finally in 1973, the legislature came back and passed a resolution urging it be changed back, and it was, in fact, changed back to Cape Canaveral.
An addendum to that I have heard. Now, I don't know how truthful this is, but as you said, the people over there didn't like this name change. They wanted it to be Cape Canaveral. And they leaned on the legislature, they leaned on the congressional delegation, and by this time, a guy named Tip O'Neill was around. And that our congressional delegation went to Tip O'Neill and said, they're killing us on this. We need to change the name back. And his response was, not so long as Mrs. Kennedy is alive. We'll never do that. And so they went and introduced a bill on the floor of the House to change Cape Cod to Cape Kennedy. And within a couple of weeks, we got Cape Canaveral back.
So. I have not heard that. That's a great
No, I haven't
story.
heard that either. Let me go back to our last segment, and I put you in the camp of saying that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. You're in the camp of the Warren report. Then is that correct?
Well, the Warren report has a lot of problems. It was hastily put together. The members were almost too distinguished. That is, they didn't do any real work on this. They just kind of voted at the end. I mean, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is not going to, do any investigative work on these kinds of things. So the Warren Commission had lots of problems. And whenever you have a case where the work is not done correctly, you're going to get conspiracy theories. They didn't follow leads. It was botched. The Dallas police bringing out Lee Harvey Oswald for a public showing on Sunday, where he was shot by Jack Ruby, and that, of course, touches off conspiracy theories. There have been books just about Jack Ruby and his role in it, and the role of the New Orleans district attorney in it. And these things just breed each other.
Yeah.
But my question is, do you think that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
Yeah.
And shot 3 shots, 2 hitting, 1 hitting Kennedy, going through Kennedy's throat, and then hitting Governor Connolly, causing his injuries, the so-called magic bullet theory, and then the second headshot from behind. That's your thought on it?
My thought on it is that the Warren Commission was kind of told the facts and or presented a set of facts and went along with them. I think had there been more investigation at the time, had there been more scientific equipment available at the time, there might have been a different set of facts. But again, Al, I keep coming back to the idea that we've had now dozens of different conspiracy theories. Was it Fidel Castro? Was it the mob? Was it?
There are different theories, but I'd like to focus on just the mechanics of the assassination for a moment, because the House Assassinations Committee did a a reinvestigation about 10 years after the assassination, 10 to 12 years later, and they came up with the probability that was in their final findings in 1979, the probability based on a dictaphone that was left open by one of the motorcycle cops, saying that based on the shots that are heard on the dictaphone, that there was more than 3 shots, and so the probability was that there was another person helping Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's what we're. I'm trying to deal with as many facts as possible. Yes, there are many conspiracy theories out there, but when you look at the shots and the statements by the doctors, to me it seems highly improbable there was only 3 shots within 6 seconds being shot from behind. Once you take that one piece of evidence, to me, then it's an open book after that. Then I can't come to a conclusive understanding that it was just one shooter. You see what I'm saying?
Well, here's the other side of that. First of all, I think the House committee was determined to find a different verdict. I think they set out to expose flaws in the Warren Commission, and believe me, that's not hard to do. But you mentioned the dictaphone belt. Mm-hmm. There is a new book out by Larry Sabota of the University of Virginia, which says that the dictaphone belt belonged to a motorcycle cop who was far away from the scene, and it's some sort of a noise of the cycles around him, that it had nothing to do with the assassination. So as these theories have been put forward, people come along and say, no, it can't be that. But we are always going to wonder what happened, because we didn't do the work in 1963. The Kennedy family did not want the body disturbed, or as disturbed as little as possible. There are questions about what happened to Kennedy's brain, what happened to the head, all these things. And a lot of it just grows out of people like Bobby Kennedy making quick decisions. No, I don't want you to do that. And unfortunately, we will never know the truth. But the one that holds up is that this strange man named Lee Harvey Oswald shot the president.
And real quickly, all sorts of theories and conspiracy stories and whatnot, arguments over the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And we'll never know the answer to that either. But one thing that usually goes unsaid, Robert Todd Lincoln ended up Lincoln's oldest son ended up in the War Department and was very active and lived on into the 1920s. And before his death, after we had passed the 50th anniversary of the Lincoln assassination, Robert Lincoln was in possession of papers that had a great deal of information on that shooting. And he thought they would just do damage to the surviving families and whatnot, and he burned them. And so we will never know. And I have if we all came back 50 years from today and we lived to be 120, we'd still probably be arguing the same points.
Well, sure. So. Yeah, exactly. The funny thing is, before we go to break, is there's still 1,000 or so pages that haven't been released. Yeah. And the question is why? Yeah. Or if there's still people still alive who may have some that are being protected. You don't know. You just don't know. I think if the government, I agree with Jim Clark, that if the government would have handled this correctly at the beginning and released these documents, then maybe we would have a better idea of what occurred on that day.
All right. Time for a pause along the network line. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day from the Department of History at the University of Central Florida is Dr. Jim Clark. We'll continue our conversation following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. So happy to be with you on Tough TV 38 and across Florida on many great stations.
And our very special guest in studio today, Dr. Jim Clark from the University of Central Florida History Department. And Jim, we got all going there on the Kennedy history and everything else. But I wanted to ask you what you've been up to here lately. And I know that you have got a brand new book out.
Actually, I have 2 books out. One is The History of Orlando, and the published by the History Press out of Charleston, South Carolina. And the other one is the first volume of an anthology of Florida writers. published by Pineapple Press.
And you were such an overachiever, Jim.
Just timing of publishing companies. But so the first volume of the anthology is out, includes 20 writers writing about Florida, and including Carl Hyacin, Dave Barry. So that was a lot of fun to do.
I was going to say that had,
The history of Orlando. One of the things that strikes me is that most of us are from somewhere else,
right? And
we've taken Ohio history or Connecticut history or something like that, and we don't know Florida history. And when you tell these stories, like the one about Walt Disney, people go, "I didn't know that," because they weren't living here. They don't know these things. So it was fun doing a book about Orlando history because people just don't know our history.
Yeah.
In a couple minutes we have left, I want to pose one more question to you guys. And that is, what would have happened if Kennedy wasn't assassinated? Where do you think we would be versus where we are? Just for fun, let's chat. Because of course, after Kennedy, we escalated the Vietnam War. Then we had Watergate. Then we had major distrust of government. Now we're stuck in the economic quagmire. So where do you think?
One of the things that we do know for sure. Kennedy wanted to run for re-election in 1964.
And he would have won, I
believe. That was a part of the trip to Dallas.
Yes.
There was a split in the Democrat Party in Texas, and they were trying to heal those differences. We know fairly well, Kennedy had several thousand troops sent to Vietnam. His notion was that he was going to get in there, have that deal done, and get them all home before the 1964 election. And obviously it didn't come out that way.
Well, I think, the Kennedy people will tell you, he realized Vietnam was a folly. He was just getting ready to get out. The day after he was killed, he was going to get out. But the fact is, when he took over, there were 1,000 military advisors, and he put in 15,000 more. He had been escalating almost every week. And I think he would have been trapped like Johnson. Remember, the last thing a Democratic president wanted to do was have a country fall to the communists on his watch. So I think that would have continued. I think the other thing is I don't think Kennedy would have gotten the civil rights legislation passed. I think it took Lyndon Johnson to do that. I also think, strangely enough, Orlando would be much different. We would not have gotten the naval base, which was a huge economic boon to us. And I think that other than that, I'm not sure what could have been different. I think.
The crazy thing about Vietnam, before we go, my final comment on that is now we trade with them, and they're still communist. Isn't that very odd? So what was 58,000 deaths for, gentlemen?
Well,
that's my question.
I think the other part of it is that Cuba is still communist, and we won't trade with them.
Yeah.
So, go figure.
90 miles off of Miami, yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. Well, these are all ongoing questions that and from time to time we do, Al and I have the opportunity to query our guests on these things and speculate a little bit. It's always great fun. And Jim, thank you so much for spending all this time
with us. My pleasure
today.
as always, Reagan.
We know you're busy. And again, Orlando, Florida, A Brief History by James C. Clark and the History Press. If you're in the Central Florida area, it is chock full of those wonderful kind of stories that Jim is so very good at telling. Well, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a brief closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry. Reagan.
Always a pleasure to have Jim Clark with us.
It is.
He's just chock full of wonderful information about the state of Florida and history in general as far as that goes.
Well, and I love getting alternative views on things, different views on history and debating, and it's always fun, and it's fun to surmise what could have been different. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it has been 50 years. And, I was reflecting on that. At the time of the 25th anniversary of the assassination, I was working in the Orlando area, and I did a 5-hour talk show on that night. And one of my guests was a fellow from the news department of that particular radio station by the name of Bill Hampton. I don't know where Bill is today or if he's even still alive, but 25 years ago he was in the studio with me, and 50 years ago he worked at WFAA in Dallas, and he was there. He didn't exactly see those few seconds where the shooting took place, but he saw the motorcade that day, and he was on the air at WFAA, and he had some very vivid memories of that day as well. So.
Well, and like I said earlier, everyone's getting older, so we're not going to be able to have these interviews for much longer, it seems like. So.
Well, let us say thank you for your time this day. We know that you are all very busy, and we do appreciate that. We hope to hear from you. Drop us a line, let us know, send an email. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Let's see you next week on the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.